The rain came down in sheets across Port Celestin, hammering against the metal walkways and turning the streets into rivers of reflected neon. Jonas Hawley pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders, his work boots splashing through puddles as he made his way home. The cargo docks had kept him late again, 12 hours of loading shipments and repairing damaged containers. His back ached, his hands were covered in grease, and all he wanted was a hot meal and his bed. The port district was always alive, even at this hour. Merchant stalls lined the streets, their owners calling out to passers-by in a dozen different languages. Aliens of every variety mingled with humans, some conducting business, others simply trying to survive another day in the sprawling colony. Port Celestin wasn't the worst place in the outer territories, but it wasn't paradise either. It was a place where people came when they had nowhere else to go. Jonas had been one of those people 5 years ago. After his transport company went bankrupt and his marriage fell apart in the same brutal month, he'd taken the first job he could find and ended up here. Loading cargo wasn't glamorous work, but it paid enough to keep a roof over his head and food in his stomach. He'd learned to keep his head down, do his job, and not ask too many questions about what was in the containers he moved. The rain intensified as he turned down a quieter side street, taking his usual shortcut through the warehouse district. The buildings here were older, some abandoned, their windows dark and their walls covered in rust. He'd walked this route 1,000 times, barely noticing his surroundings anymore. But tonight, something made him stop. It was a sound barely audible over the drumming rain. A soft, broken crying, like a wounded animal trying to hide its pain. Jonas paused, water dripping from his hair into his eyes. He told himself to keep walking. The port was full of sad stories, and he couldn't save everyone. Hell, he could barely save himself. The crying came again, weaker this time. He cursed under his breath and turned toward the sound. It was coming from behind a stack of discarded shipping crates in the narrow gap between two warehouse buildings. Jonas approached slowly, his hand instinctively moving to the small knife he kept in his belt. You didn't survive long in places like this without being careful. What he found made him freeze. Huddled against the wet concrete, partially hidden behind a rusted piece of machinery, was a child. But not a human child. Her skin was a soft lavender color, her features delicate and angular. She had large eyes that caught the dim light, reflecting it back like a cat's. Her hair was long and dark, plastered to her face by the rain. She wore what looked like the remains of a rough textile wrap, torn and filthy. Her thin arms were wrapped around her knees, and she was shaking, whether from cold or fear. Jonas couldn't tell. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old, if he was judging alien development correctly. She was clearly Velthari, one of the species that had been hit hardest by the trafficking rings operating in the outer sectors. Jonas had heard stories, whispered conversations among dock workers, about ships that moved cargo that wasn't listed on any manifest. The child saw him, and her crying stopped abruptly. Her eyes went wide with terror, and she pressed herself harder against the wall, making herself as small as possible. Jonas raised his hands slowly, palms out. "Hey," he said softly, trying to make his voice as gentle as possible. "I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't respond, just stared at him with those impossibly large eyes. He could see her entire body trembling. He slowly lowered himself into a crouch, making sure to keep some distance between them. The rain continued to pour, soaking them both. "You can't stay out here," he said. "You'll freeze." Still no response. He wondered if she even understood him. Many species had translation implants, but a child this young, especially one who looked like she'd been through hell, probably didn't have access to such technology. Jonas reached into his jacket pocket, moving very slowly so as not to startle her. He pulled out a protein bar, one of the emergency rations he kept for long shifts. He unwrapped it carefully and set it on the ground between them, and slid it toward her Dot, the child's eyes fixed on the food. She looked at it, then at him, then back at the food. Her small hand crept forward, trembling, and snatched the bar. She brought it to her mouth and began eating in quick, desperate bites, like someone who didn't know when they'd eat again. Jonas's heart clenched in his chest. He'd seen a lot in his years, but something about this small, terrified creature eating his protein bar in the rain broke through the walls he'd built around himself. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. The child paused in her eating and looked at him. Her lips moved, forming a word so soft he almost couldn't hear it over the rain. Myra. The name was slightly distorted by her accent, but clear enough. Jonas nodded. "Myra, that's a pretty name." He pointed to himself. "Jonas." She watched him carefully, still chewing. There was intelligence in those eyes, and pain far beyond what any child should carry. "Where's your family, Myra?" At that question, something shifted in her expression. Her face crumpled, and fresh tears began to roll down her cheeks, mixing with the rain. She shook her head frantically and said something in her own language. A string of words that Jonas couldn't understand, but that sounded like heartbreak. He made a decision then. Probably a stupid one, but he made it anyway. "Come with me," he said, standing slowly and extending his hand. "Just for tonight. Somewhere warm and dry. I promise I won't hurt you." Myra stared at his outstretched hand like it might be a trap. Jonas waited, rain streaming down his face, his arm getting tired. He was about to give up when she slowly, carefully, reached out and placed her small hand in his Dot. Her skin was cold as Ice Dot Jonas helped her to her feet, and she stood unsteadily, favoring one leg. She was so light, so fragile. He wanted to pick her up and carry her, but he sensed that would terrify her. Instead, he kept hold of her hand and began walking slowly, letting her set the pace. They made their way through the rain-soaked streets, an odd pair. A few people glanced at them, but this was Port Celestin. Strange sights were common, and most people had learned to mind their own business. Jonas's apartment was small, just 2 rooms in a converted warehouse building. But it was clean, warm, and dry. He unlocked the door and led Myra inside, watching as she took in her surroundings with wide, wondering eyes. She stood in the middle of the room, dripping water onto his floor, looking lost and overwhelmed. Jonas grabbed a towel from his bathroom and wrapped it around her shoulders. She flinched at first, then relaxed slightly as the warmth soaked in. "Let me get you something to eat," he said, moving to his small kitchen. Something better than a protein bar. He heated up some soup, simple vegetable broth that he hoped wouldn't upset an alien digestive system. While it warmed, he found an old shirt of his and brought it to her. "You should get out of those wet clothes," he said, pointing to the bathroom. "You can change in there." Myra looked at the shirt, then at the bathroom door, then back at him. Slowly, she took the shirt and disappeared into the bathroom. Closing the door behind her Dot, Jonas let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. What was he doing? He didn't know anything about taking care of a child, especially not an alien child. He should call Colony Services, report that he'd found an abandoned kid. They'd take her, put her in the system, find her proper care. But even as he thought it, he knew he wouldn't make that call. Not tonight, anyway. Not until he knew she was safe. Myra emerged from the bathroom wearing his shirt, which hung on her like a dress. She looked slightly less terrified now, though still cautious. Jonas handed her a bowl of soup and watched as she sat on the edge of his couch and began to eat, slowly this time, savoring each spoonful. He sat in the chair across from her, not too close, giving her space. "You're safe here," he said quietly. "No one's going to hurt you." She looked up at him, soup bowl cradled in her small hands. And for the first time, he saw something other than fear in her eyes. It might have been hope, fragile and uncertain, but it was there. Outside, the rain continued to fall on Port Celestin, washing the streets clean, at least for one night. Inside the small apartment, warmth and quiet settled over two souls who had found each other in the darkness. Jonas didn't know it yet, but his life had just changed forever. And somewhere out in the rainy night, another pair of eyes watched his building, a mother's eyes, filled with desperate relief and painful longing, before disappearing back into the shadows. The morning light filtered through the thin curtains of Jonas's apartment, casting soft patterns across the floor. He woke up stiff and sore from sleeping in his chair, having given Mira the bed. For a moment, he'd forgotten about the previous night, but then he heard the soft sound of breathing and remembered. Myra was still asleep, curled into a tiny ball on his bed, the blanket pulled up to her chin. In the daylight, he could see her more clearly. The bruises on her arms, faint but unmistakable. The way her ribs showed through her thin frame. The scared, haunted look that remained even in sleep. Jonas moved quietly to the kitchen and started making breakfast. He wasn't much of a cook, but he could manage eggs and toast. As the smell of food filled the apartment, he heard movement behind him. Mira had woken up and was standing in the doorway, watching him with those large, cautious eyes. "Good morning," he said gently. "Are you hungry?" She nodded slowly, then made her way to the small table and sat down. Jonas placed a plate in front of her, and she began eating carefully, still watching him as if he might suddenly turn dangerous. They ate in silence for a while before Jonas spoke. "Myra, I need to ask you something. Is there anyone I should contact? Anyone looking for you?" Her face went pale, and she shook her head violently. She said something in her language, her voice rising with panic. Okay, Jonas said quickly, raising his hands. "It's all right. You don't have to go anywhere you don't want to go." She calmed slightly, but her hands were shaking as she set down her fork. Jonas realized he'd have to be more careful with his questions. The next few days fell into an unexpected rhythm. Jonas would go to work at the docks, leaving Mira with enough food and entertainment to keep her occupied. He'd come home to find her exactly where he'd left her, as if she was afraid to move or touch anything without permission. Slowly, very slowly, she began to relax Dot by the end of the first week. She was exploring the apartment, looking at his few possessions with curiosity. She'd found an old datapad he used for reading and figured out how to access children's programs. He'd come home to find her watching educational videos, absorbing human language at an incredible rate. "Jonas," she said one evening, her pronunciation careful and deliberate. It was one of the first times she'd spoken his name out loud. He looked up from his dinner. "Yes?" "Thank you." The words were simple, but they carried weight. "You're welcome, Myra." She hesitated, then asked, "I can stay? More days?" Jonas felt something twist in his chest. "As long as you need to?" Her smile was small but genuine, the first real smile he'd seen from her. It transformed her face, making her look like the child she should be, rather than the traumatized survivor she'd been forced to become. But peace, Jonas was learning, was always temporary in places like Port Celestin. It was 2 weeks after he'd found Mira when Jonas first noticed he was being watched. He was walking home from the docks, taking his usual route, when he caught sight of a figure standing across the street. The figure wasn't doing anything obvious, just standing there. But something about the way they held themselves set off alarm bells in Jonas's mind. He'd lived in rough places long enough to recognize when someone was being observed. He kept walking, not changing his pace, but his mind was racing. Who would be watching him? And more importantly, why? The answer came to him with cold certainty. Myra, Someone was looking for her. Jonas took a different route home, weaving through side streets and doubling back twice to make sure he wasn't followed. When he finally reached his building, he climbed the stairs quickly and locked the door behind him. Mira was sitting on the couch, drawing pictures on paper he'd brought her. She looked up as he entered, and her smile faded when she saw his expression. "What wrong?" she asked, her grasp of human language improving daily. Jonas tried to smile reassuringly. "Nothing. Just tired." But he wasn't fooling her. She'd learned to read danger in people's faces long before she'd learned to read words. That night, after Myra had gone to bed, Jonas sat by the window and watched the street below. For hours, he saw nothing unusual. He was beginning to think he'd imagined it when movement caught his eye. A figure emerged from the shadows across the street, moving carefully, keeping to the darkness. Jonas tensed, his hand moving to the emergency alert on his device. But then the figure stepped briefly into the light, and Jonas's breath caught Dot. It was a woman, Valkyrie like Mira, but older. Even from this distance, Jonas could see the resemblance. The same delicate features, the same large eyes. She was thin, too thin, and she moved with a limp. She stood there, staring up at his window, and even though Jonas couldn't see her expression clearly, he could feel the weight of her gaze. She stood there for nearly 5 minutes, just watching. Then, as quickly as she'd appeared, she melted back into the shadows and was gone. Jonas's mind raced. Was that Myra's mother? If so, why didn't she approach? Why was she hiding in the shadows? And if she wasn't the mother, who was she? The next morning, Jonas made a decision. He contacted an old friend from his transport days, a woman named Riel, who now worked in colony records. He asked her to search for any reports of missing Valkyrie children or refugees. He tried to be casual about it, claiming he'd heard rumors at the docks, but Riel was sharp. "Why the sudden interest in Valkyrie refugees, Jonas?" she asked. "Just curious," he said. "You hear things, you know." Wanted to know if there was any truth to the stories. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Jonas, if you've gotten yourself involved in something, you need to be careful. There are some very dangerous people operating in the outer sectors. People who don't like questions. I'm just asking, Riel. That's all." She sighed. "I'll look into it. But Jonas? Watch your back." The call ended, and Jonas sat in silence, staring at the device in his hand. What had he gotten himself into? The answer came 2 days later, but not from Riel. Jonas was at the market with Myra, holding her hand as they browsed the stalls. She'd been cooped up in the apartment for weeks, and he'd decided she needed some fresh air, some semblance of normalcy. She was fascinated by everything, pointing at colorful fruits and strange alien trinkets with childlike wonder. They were examining a display of handmade toys when Jonas felt it again, that prickling sensation of being watched. He turned slowly, scanning the crowd, and there, standing by a fruit vendor, was a man. Human, tall, with a scar running down his left cheek. He was looking directly at them. When their eyes met, the man didn't look away. Instead, he smiled, a cold, predatory expression that made Jonas's blood run cold. "Myra," Jonas said quietly. "We're leaving, now." He scooped her up, ignoring her startled protest, and began walking quickly toward the exit. Behind him, he could hear footsteps following. He walked faster, weaving through the crowd, his heart pounding. They burst out of the market and into the street. Jonas looked around frantically, then ducked into a narrow alley between 2 buildings. He set Myra down and pressed them both against the wall, his hand over her mouth to keep her quiet. Footsteps echoed in the main street, slowing, then stopping. Jonas held his breath, counting the seconds. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved on. Jonas waited another full minute before he dared to move. When he finally looked down at Mira, her eyes were huge with fear, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," he whispered, removing his hand. "I'm so sorry. But we had to hide." She threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder. He held her tight, feeling her small body shake with silent sobs. They made it home without further incident. But Jonas knew things had changed. Someone was actively looking for Mira, and they weren't being subtle about it anymore. That night, after Myra had finally fallen asleep, Jonas sat in the darkness and made plans. He would need supplies, a way to defend him if it came to that. He would need to be more careful, more vigilant. He was so lost in thought that he almost missed the soft knock on his door. Jonas froze. It was past midnight. No one should be knocking at this hour. He moved silently to the door and checked the security viewer. A woman stood in the hallway, her hood pulled low over her face. She was looking down, but Jonas could see enough. Lavender skin, delicate features. The same woman from the street. His hand hovered over the lock. This could be a trap. It probably was a trap, but something made him hesitate. The woman looked up, directly at the security camera, and lowered her hood. Her face was gaunt, marked with old scars. Her eyes were filled with desperate hope and crushing fear, and she looked exactly like Myra. Jonas made a decision that would change everything. He opened the door. The woman stepped inside quickly, moving with the nervous energy of a hunted animal. Up close, Jonas could see how badly she'd been hurt. Fresh bruises on her arms, a barely healed cut across her cheek, the way she favored her left leg. They stood facing each other in the dim light of his apartment. Neither spoke for a long moment. Then the woman's eyes moved past him to the bedroom door where Myra slept. Her whole body seemed to tremble, and tears began streaming down her face. "Is she—" The woman's voice was barely a whisper, rough from disuse or pain. "Is she alive? Is my daughter alive?" Jonas swallowed hard. "Yes, she's sleeping." The woman's legs seemed to give out, and she sank to her knees, covering her face with her hands. Great. Silent sobs shook her body. Jonas didn't know what to do. He stood there awkwardly, watching this stranger cry on his floor. Finally, he moved to the kitchen and got her a glass of water. He brought it to her, and she took it with shaking hands. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for keeping her safe. Thank you for—" Her voice broke. "Thank you." Jonas helped her to the couch. She sat on the edge, still trembling, clutching the water glass like a lifeline. "What's your name?" Jonas asked gently. "Nessa," she said. "Nessa Varn. And you? You are the one who saved her." "I'm Jonas. Jonas Hawley. I found her in the rain about 2 weeks ago." She was alone and scared. Nessa's face crumpled again. "I left her there. I had to. They were following me, and I couldn't." She took a shaky breath. "I couldn't let them find her. So I hid her and led them away. I've been trying to get back to her ever since, but they've been watching, always watching." "Who?" Jonas asked. "Who's been watching?" Nessa looked at him with eyes that had seen too much horror. "The people who owned us. The people we escaped from." Before Jonas could respond, a small voice came from the bedroom doorway. "Mama?" Both adults turned. Myra stood there in Jonas's oversized shirt, her eyes wide, staring at Nessa like she was seeing a ghost. "Myra," Nessa breathed. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then Myra ran, faster than Jonas had ever seen her move, straight into her mother's arms. Nessa caught her, holding her so tightly it looked like she might never let go. They both cried, speaking rapid words in their own language, touching each other's faces as if to confirm the other was real. Jonas stepped back, giving them space, feeling like an intruder in his own home. but also feeling something else, something warm and painful in his chest. He'd brought them back together. Whatever happened next, at least he'd done that after a long time. Myra pulled back and looked at her mother, then at Jonas. She reached out one small hand to him. Jonas took it, and Myra pulled him closer until he was standing right beside them. "Jonas, good," Myra said to her mother in halting human language. "Jonas, keep me safe. He papa now too." Nessa looked up at Jonas, her eyes meeting his, and in that moment, something passed between them. Understanding, maybe, or the beginning of something neither of them had expected. "Then I owe him everything," Nessa said softly, still holding her daughter, still looking at Jonas. "Everything I have and everything I am." Outside, the night continued, and somewhere in the darkness, dangerous people were hunting. But for this moment, in this small apartment, something like hope had taken root. And Jonas Hawley, who thought he'd lost the ability to care about anything beyond his own survival, realized he would do whatever it took to protect them both.